Hello from very warm Bangalore. And as I said, we were going through a heat wave. So, as we said a few minutes ago, that if we had been in person in Canada, we would have been with something warm. But right now, I just have these very cool jasmine flowers to keep me company, and they're very cool. So that's what's going.
I'm jealous.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate that Bangalore, we can just step out and buy all these fresh roses and fresh jasmines, and right now, this is going to be keeping me company on my bedside table. So yeah.
Mm. I was just saying earlier, before we started recording, that spring is taking a little bit longer to bloom here, but normally around this time we have lilac blooming.
Oh, nice! How
Yeah,
beautiful!
and I just remember a couple of years ago I had cut some lilac flowers and put them on my table, our kitchen table. And I remember the scent just traveling all the way up to my room
Wow!
when I was sleeping. It's like this, wisp
Wow!
lilac as you sleep. And it's just such a lovely scent. It's so grounding to have that. And
You
there's
know,
something different about fresh flowers.
I absolutely. And lilacs is something I've read so often about and I've like seen pictures of. But as you said, there's something about actually inhaling a flower that makes
Mhm.
all the difference. So, for example, like when I put pictures of, like in Hindi, we call it the Desi Gulab. And I believe it's a musk rose from when I looked it up, but it's as roses go. I mean, it is a beautiful flower, but the fragrance, oh my god, like every time I put a picture, I just wish I could transport that fragrance. And especially like on warm evenings, the fragrance becomes even more pronounced. So you're sitting and you're just surrounded by this fragrance, and whatever memory association, like you just described that beautiful lilac memory association. For me, Desi Gulab I associate with weddings and winter, because yeah, winter in Rajasthan. And yeah, and I think, and now I guess after being in Bangalore for so long, I associate it with flower stalls and flower markets. So yeah.
I think I remember having correspondence with you on one of our social media platforms.
Yeah.
And we were talking about Ajmer because I had
Right.
gone to Ajmer a couple of years ago for the Jaipur Lit Fest, and well, I was in Jaipur, but I was like, I need to go to Ajmer,
Right.
Sharif, and
Right.
it's so interesting that you referenced the rose, um, and that's something that I will always associate with Ajmer. Just
Oh,
even
interesting.
yeah, because when we went to the dargah, the the scent of rose was just overwhelming, and then you get
I
into the tomb and it's just showered in rose petals. And so I keep coming back to that image. It's almost like an ancestral um grounding flower for me as well.
wow.
I keep returning to rose. So it's interesting how we have that connection as well. Um,
Right.
because I know you were mentioning that you have history in Rajasthan.
Yes, yes. And it's interesting because my father has an ancestral Haveli in Ajmer, and it's very nearby to the Dargah. And when you mentioned the rose, so there's also Pushkar, which is near to Ajmer, and which is a very important pilgrimage site. And the rose of Pushkar, it's a pink rose. I'm wondering if that's a rose you are talking about.
Yeah.
And oh my goodness, so like you know, growing up in Oman, and I think I might have mentioned to you that I'm writing an essay. I've written an essay about flowers, photographing flowers in the pandemic. And hopefully it'll be coming out soon. But I touch upon how, like, when I was in Oman, the only like we used to see roses in like freezer compartments because they'd come all the way down from Netherlands. But what I didn't realize is that like there's a place in Oman called Jabal Akhtar, which means green mountain in Arabic, and they grow roses.
Wow.
And they have and this is the same rose that they grow in Pushkar, I believe. I think just judging from the appearance. And oh my God, the fragrance, the sight. So now that we're speaking about it, like how flowers have from different parts of which are important to me, different places which are important to me, are like connected in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you shared that Ajmer memory with me, it just conjured up so many associations. And as I said, for example, for some reason, I always associate roses with winter, the
Mm-hmm.
cold and like the sunlight and, it's, so yeah.
Yeah, I did go to Pushkar as well. So
Okay.
yeah, first we went to Ajmer and then we went
Right,
to Pushkar and we went to the temple.
right.
And one of the most beautiful things we saw is that there's this tradition of um, prasad being sent to the
Wow.
Durga from the temple and
Two.
flowers. Yeah, and roses
Yeah.
to the temple from the Dargah. And it's just been something, I think it's been going on for many, many years.
And
Um,
and it's such a beautiful syncretic tradition, which like, and I didn't know about this until you shared it with me. And it's such an affirming thing, to know that these traditions are going to endure. It's traditions like these which remind, what the subcontinental culture is about.
mhm.
And just like something like, this exchange of flowers is just so beautiful. So I read, so thanks so much for sharing about it. I think,
Yeah, I
it,
actually forgot about it, and I sometimes I know that you like to go back into your archives of photos and
right,
and remember those memories, and I'm like that too. I'm probably the friend or family member in the group that's always taking pictures, and people
right,
are like, why can you just not take pictures? And I'm like, no, because they're anchors for me. They're anchors of memory.
right,
So
right.
at the end of the year, I'll look back at the photos I've taken, and then it kind of opens a window into those memories.
That is so, so true. In fact, I'm just going to interrupt. Can you hear the train in the
Yeah, it
background?
adds to the ambiance.
Okay, fine. Yeah, we live next
Just
to a train
for
station.
people watching, I'm in Toronto and Priyanka is in Bangalore. So
Yeah, all right. We just went straight into it. So I live close by to a train station, which is makes for entertaining um, soundtrack to our lives here at the apartment. But yeah, what was I going to say? But yeah, I think it's really when I got my smartphone like about 9 years ago. And that's when I had moved to Pittsburgh. I'd been living in Oman, and then I got married and I moved to Pittsburgh in January 2013. And it coincided with winter and how it was gradually turning to spring. Although, like Pittsburgh, spring took a long time in coming.
Mhm.
So it was probably not until like maybe around this time of the year that, but whatever it was like a wonderful way to document. And it became my, as I said, it became my visual journal, scrapbook. And yeah, it has remained the way it has because now if I have to remember something like when did this happen, I just know, like I associate the picture I've taken,
Mhm.
and to the extent that like I will remember the mood I was in. So it's like it's a repository of so many other things, not
Yeah.
just that moment, place. It's also a repository of me, like, what I was feeling at that time. So so I have a picture. I remember like I went to Kashmir 2 years ago and I fractured my arm in the middle of the
Oh
holiday,
no.
which I fell off a pony.
Wow,
it's it,
story.
it's made for a very, at that time, I mean, of course, it was not very amusing, but like, yeah, who does that? So I remember there are pictures of me in the glacier. So we were en route to a glacier and I was dying with pain, but I'm smiling. And it's just so interesting to look at those pictures because, yeah, it's like, you know,
You survived that.
yes, I survived, but it was a very beautiful glacier, which I was still able to appreciate. And I
Mm.
got some pebbles from there as well.
Oh, I love that.
So, yeah,
That's so interesting too, because I think about um, those reminders from our own lives and how sometimes we forget that we can persist, right? And that we have that resilience. And um,
right,
I find that too when I look at photos, I'm like, oh yeah, what was I going through at that time? And it was that mixture of joy and pain, and
right.
somehow we made it through that time. So um it's also a reminder for ourselves that both of those things
Absolutely.
can exist at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as I was saying, like before it started recording, but last year, so when I got COVID and I was hospitalized, so my room was on like, I think it was the sixth or seventh floor. So it looked out to this. So Bangalore is, of course, there are a lot of like, it's a green, it's known as a garden city. A
Mhm.
lot of trees, unfortunately, there's been decline as well. But from my vantage point, I could see there are these trees called copper pot trees, and they become entirely yellow. So at that time of the year, which was around this time of the year, so I remember going up and seeing these trees, and I took a picture. And after that, like because I didn't. At the same time, I didn't want reminders of that time. So iPhone has a hidden folder, but I know they're there. Like they're sort of like, as you said, very like they're like memorials to that time, and how difficult, painful, and there was so much. Even they're both like a reminders of the trauma, but they're also reminders of like I made it, I went past that, and now when I see these trees blooming again after a year, I'm just like, yeah, no time ever remains the same. And we've completed another year around the sun, and in this case those flowers are like little suns. So yeah.
Mhm. I love that those memories are punctuated by flowers and trees, and yet even if they remain the same, like they are consistently blooming year after year, it's almost like a marker of how much we've changed. um
Right,
because
right.
I feel that way about certain flowers and even birds. I'll see a cardinal.
Wow.
Like a cardinal is a very, I guess, symbolic bird. um and it's a red bird, and so when you see it against the snow, there's almost a sense of hope, like a reminder
Right. Yeah.
will shift and change. And so whenever I see a cardinal, it's that instant reminder for me. And yet I forget
Right,
how much has
right.
changed over the years, right? But the cardinal is still red. So yeah, I find that so fascinating. But also what you
True.
said about you know, these photos being painful reminders, because it's interesting. I have that, but with my poems, like there are certain poems, actually my first collection of poems, where there was a point where I just couldn't read them. I couldn't go back and read
Right.
them because they were those memories of a time where I was going through a lot of pain. And so it was so visceral for me to revisit those poems, that I couldn't for a long time read those poems again. So
Wow.
yeah.
That it's I sometimes have these reaction with pictures, but but poems, it's interesting. Like I feel at times it depends, of course, how long ago they were written, but sometimes they become so distant that it feels like it's someone else has written them. And
Mhm.
I feel this way with older pictures of mine featuring me, that, oh, it's like this person is no longer the same. So I can easily share it, that picture, I can share that poem. So but as I said, distance is everything. Like, maybe something that is still like, for example, maybe after many years, the tree pictures I was talking about, um, that I took from my hospital window, I can see them, but maybe now, like, they're still. So I think, yeah, it depends on how we. There's some works that we feel so strongly about, or as you said, they're still a part of us, and some works we've sort of let them out, and now they're leading their own lives,
I
so to
love
speak.
that. Yeah.
So yeah, but
Yeah, it's almost like an indication of where we still need to heal. And
right, right,
yeah.
right.
I'm so glad. I mean, I'm so glad that we came across each other, and in such an interesting way too, through Instagram. But
Yes.
I think one of the things that really resonated with me about your practice is that it's um, so many layers of expression. So you have your photography, you have art as well that you do, visual art, and then you have a writing practice. And it's similar for me as well. I mean, I'm not a photographer in that sense of the word, but I am a visual artist and also a writer. And so I was just wondering how did that kind of practice emerge for you? Did you first start with one practice and then another complemented it? Because for me, that's what happened. Like I always wanted to be a writer. I started with poetry
Right.
and writing, but then I found like there was a certain point in my writing practice where I was so debilitated by perfectionism or the need for perfectionism that I couldn't write. And so I would go on these nature walks and I would notice things that I wouldn't notice before. Like it could be a broken acorn or like a fiery leaf, just something that was calling to me. And I would pick these things up and then create something out of them, a pattern or a shape, and leave it there. Take a photo of it, document it, but then leave it there to be kind of transformed by the elements. So for me, it was a complementary practice to letting go of this internalized need for perfection in my writing. And then it developed into its own practice. So for you, what was that like? Did it start with writing as well, or did you have these complementary practices at the same time?
Sure,
How did
sure.
it evolve for you?
So it was really fascinating to hear about, like, what you're saying about, what meant the perfectionism and the nature walks, and how, things, I mean, like, these nature walks took you sort of like, literally on another path. I think for me, so for a long time, I wrote a lot of poetry until, like, in my early 20s. Then there was a big lull. And so I wasn't doing anything creative. Like, I wanted to do a lot of creative things, and it so happened, like, as I said, once again, I've always enjoyed photography. I feel that I think in images, and I
Mm,
feel that my writing is very imagistic as well. But for me at that time, photography was just something that I did. Like, I mean, they weren't, Facebook was still like, in initial stages, and as other social media platforms developed, but I was very reluctant to share, like, at that stage of my life. But I think, I have to credit, like, a lot with coming on Instagram. So I know um, everyone has so many thoughts about Instagram, and, like, what it has evolved into, etc. But for me, it was somewhere I could start sharing. And as I said, it tied in with my personal chapter in life, where I was documenting this new life. And as it happened, I started to really enjoy expressing, through photography. And I found that, like, for me, sometimes that what I could not say through in my writing, I was expressing through photography. So in a way, I do feel that, I mean, that my photographs are often like, they are photo poems, in the sense that, like, they are conveying several things. And I feel that, what I couldn't do in my writing, and I wasn't writing poetry then. So I started writing poetry again after that huge lull in 2017, which is when I coincidentally moved to Bangalore. And yeah, in fact, we're speaking and almost at April is ending, but I discovered the National Poetry Writing, that it's a poetry month, sorry, not writing. And I discovered NAPO Remo, which is National Poetry Writing Month. And I started writing poems every day. And so, yeah, and since a lot of my responses were, and all my poetry was in response to my images. Of course, now I'm going to a point where I write poetry independent of images. But at that time, you could say they were my prompt, they were my anchor, they were my framework. So yeah, so it was something that started off separately, but they've like sort of merged.
Mm.
And the visual art just came around, like, as I became more comfortable expressing myself in photography, I hadn't painted since I was a child. I used to love to paint. And I think as you grow older, you lose in touch with that, whatever the things you used to, like the inner child's toys or play. And for me, I just found I was enjoying. I'm not an artist by, like, it is, for me, art is joy. It is one thing which I do, like, even with writing, and to an extent maybe even photography as well. I have standards for myself, expectations. But in art, I have no expectations. Whatever I create, I don't even mind sharing, because I'm like, I did it with joy. So yeah, and all of these things have complemented in the sense that they all enhance. So on the days if I'm stuck in my writing, I will, I'll just give it a break. And now picture taking comes to me so naturally. Like, it's just something, like, as I said, it's like a visual journal. I probably photo journal a lot more than I write. So yeah, that is how these things have merged. And I can't imagine my life without. I mean, I was always a writer, but now, like, especially photography has become a very important part.
Mhm.
And of course the subjects I take off. So yeah.
I love that you said you think in images because I realize that I do too. I thought that I first process through words, but I don't. Like
Right.
even before I write my books or have an idea for a book, it comes to
Yeah.
me an image or colors. So
Wow.
I knew
Yeah.
I knew that this book was going to be green and gold before I
Oh,
even
nice.
yeah, before
Right.
I even knew what it would look like or the structure or anything like that. And
Yeah.
even for poems, sometimes they just come to me as visuals first. So it's really interesting that you say that it's, you think in images, but also the other thing that really resonated with me from what you said was that art is joy and creating art is joy. And it's a place where there's no judgment because you're bringing back those inner child's tools, right? And
Yes,
I think
absolutely.
sometimes, yeah, sometimes when you're a published writer or um, do art for a living, there's that danger of losing that joy of creating for the sake of creating because
Right.
there's this expectation, whether it's your own or your industries, that everything has to end up being a product. um
Right.
you know,
Absolutely.
capitalism. But yeah, just to
Yeah.
claim that process for yourself, I think is so important. And thank you for that reminder for me as well, because I tend to forget that
Right.
unconsciously. It's an unconscious thing that
It
happens.
is. And as I said, like, we mentioned, like, productivity is such a, like, the last 2 years of pandemic have been so difficult on all of us in myriad ways, whether it's been physiologically, physically. I mean, there's so many things. And when it comes to, like, so I actually really started getting more into, like, painting Probably like, so my first few months of the pandemic, I was stranded in California, and it was about 3.5 months. And when we got back, finally got back to India, like after what seemed like forever. And I think it was, India was still like, everyone was coming to terms with like the virus, and like how, I mean, when it first began, I don't know, for some reason I thought it would just go away.
Mhm.
I don't know, none of us knew what it was going to be like, but we were still like getting used to this. Not now, this is part of our life. And I think the painting just became a way of escape, in a way that, like, sometimes like the things that like writing and photography was not being able to offer, because it was also tied up with, like, how much am I producing. And as I often like to say, I've been told so many times, as a perpetual overthinker, like, meditate, do yoga, do this, but it doesn't work for me, like, personally speaking, it doesn't resonate with me. So painting became my meditation, and just to break from overthinking about, everything that was going on at that time. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's why more than ever, like, I associate, like, even now I will just the, watercolors for me was just like playing around with fluid movements and flow of color. And yeah, and eventually I started doing more of like painting flowers and leaves or whatever. But yeah, even that was marked by just finding joy in it,
Mhm.
not like something that I could get out of. So, sorry,
That's
long-winded,
no, no,
long-winded
no.
journey into how, like, a simple thing to say that painting gives me so much joy. But
I think
yeah,
that's
that really was
powerful.
the backstory to it.
No, no, no. And I think that's very powerful because I remember talking to a lot of writers during the early days of the pandemic, and so many of us couldn't write. Like there was something just, it's like we didn't have the words yet, you know?
Right, right,
And so,
absolutely.
yeah. And so I started to do this practice as well. That was just for myself, and
Right,
making a mandala a day. So, and I was just using natural materials or what
right,
I find in my home.
right.
And so that was the grounding practice or the anchoring kind of meditation that I did every day. So as you were speaking about painting, it really deeply resonated, because I think maybe it also gave us an opportunity to return to that child in us,
Right,
just
right,
that comfort and grounding, and remember like, oh, why are we doing this? We started doing art or creating art or writing because um, it was a healing process for us, right? And then it
right.
developed into something else. So yeah, it was a really interesting time for me to sit with myself as well and return to that simplicity. And just as you were talking about fluid movement and playing with color,
Yes,
it's the same idea of just like coming back into your body and using your hands again, in
right,
ways
absolutely.
that maybe we
Yes.
haven't in a while.
It's like, so many people were dancing, but since I'm fond of saying I have three left feet, there's no way I could dance. So when you talked about, like, even the act of painting is like, it's sort of like, we use different like joints or muscles when we're typing or writing. The act of painting uses differently. So, it's just even like a simple shift in how we used our bodies. And these are only things I'm realizing as we're speaking about it, because you don't introspect. At that time I just did whatever came intuitively.
Mm.
And in fact, I forgot to mention, but when I was in California itself, I had kept a nature journal,
Oh.
and I forgot that. And it's funny, right? Because so many of my memories of that time in the pandemic are clouded over of fear, of stress, like, but it was also time because we were like, the rules allowed us to go out into parks or whatever. And yeah, so I think those going to that park and coming back and creating those journals was kind of like a yeah, it was an anchor. It was that one thing that kept me sane during those times when everything else was so like unclear and vague. And, and for an anxious person, like the biggest enemy is uncertainty. So just having those things was kind of, and I would like, and I actually pressed a lot of flowers as well. So yeah, but yeah, going back to memory and, I'd almost forgotten about it, but yeah, it's something that just came back to me.
Mhm. I look to the side because I have a nature journal here that I haven't
Oh,
started.
okay.
And you just reminded me because that was
Yeah,
one of my intentions was to start a nature journal,
yeah,
especially during the spring, those transitional seasons.
true, true.
So thank you for that reminder.
I look forward. In fact, I have to say that I haven't painted or, I create collages as well. So this discussion has just reminded me, like, why haven't I done this in so long? So time to go back to my writing desk, which I actually only use to create art. I somehow
I love that.
write or sit on the couch. So that's something.
I hardly
That's
use my desk, so I'm with you on that.
yeah.
So we've spoken a lot about our poetry and our writing practice, and so maybe it's a good time to share some of our work.
Yeah.
So I thought that we could start with one of your beautiful pieces here.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I remember like I created a series about the moon. So this is sort of like the half moon. And I had oil in the series, I have a full moon and I have a new moon. So this is the half moon one. And yeah, so should I read it aloud?
Yeah,
That's how we
please
can
go
go.
ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, on those ink still nights, thousand moons come alive. In a cold, silent desert, a white flower slowly reveals itself, one gentle limb of light opening after another.
So beautiful. Thank you. And when I read this poem, it immediately reminded me of a poem that I had written. So this is
Right.
the first few stanzas of it, but
Yeah.
I'll read it and then we can discuss or share. Thousands stand behind me, ashen statues bracing the wind, holding stillness like a vow. Bellowing saris, white shells against the moon, starched turbans, white feathers against the night. A ghost light flickers with the Morse code of "We never left." I trace the dust of bloodlines, brow bones, and jaw lines. We have broken the inked silk of the Ran, crossing this terrain for centuries. What use is a map? Your heartbeat is the compass.
It's so I just wanted to say that I heard your poem read out your poems on the Desi Books podcast.
Oh,
And it was incredible because they're so visceral, they're so rich, and that, like, I felt that I was inhabiting the spaces, places, and moments that you talk about. And in this case, so Run is one place I've been wanting to visit for a long time.
let's go,
Yes,
Priyanka.
yes, yes, let's do that. Let's do that. And the whole landscape is just, I mean, from whatever I've seen, it's like we're on a, despite being on Earth, it seems like we're on a different planet.
Yeah.
So I think that poem, and as we were speaking beforehand, the ways the my words and your words, they sort of like, I mean, it's sort of like the image of, for me, is like two ships meeting at night, like,
Yes. Yeah.
it's so like, I really love that.
Yeah, I just found it so interesting because when I read your poem, I immediately saw the image. And so, like, the thousand stand behind me, like that image kind of came to me almost in a dream. Like, right before you go to sleep, you kind of have these, sometimes you have these images
Yes,
come to you.
yes, yes.
So I imagined like all my ancestors behind me. And
Oh,
that's what that first line was about, because my ancestors, we can trace our lineage back to Kutch and like Kutch Gujarat. So I read a lot about the region, and I've been to India, but I haven't been to Gujarat. And so it's that imagining of being in that place where my ancestors lived, worked, dreamed, ate, toiled, right? And then also knowing that that place exists um, in my mind, like it's still alive. And when I read your poem, the last line of those like unfurling of the petals, like I immediately just saw all again, like the thousands of ancestors almost blooming. So it felt
wow.
like a continuation. And even though we wrote the poem separately, the fact that we have similar words like thousands, moon, white,
And the cold, the desert, and
desert,
it's
yes.
it's interesting because I think a lot of my poems, like, so I grew up in Oman, which is a desert. And I think at heart, and my roots are in Rajasthan, which is also a desert. So I think the desert is in, and as much as I love living in a green place and I'm surrounded by so much greenery in Bangalore, I actually sometimes say to my husband that, oh my God, the green is hurting my eyes. I want the desert. I think, yeah. And this idea of, and I was imagining these desert flowers, these cacti. So what I mean to say is that, like, the way the images have converged in each of our poems, but, like, and in a way they also harken back to our roots, of
Mhm.
course, in different ways, but still, it's just like the essence of both of our works. It's there's a very, like, radiance coming from it. Like,
Mhm.
uh, it seems very, I'm not being able to put in words, but it's like a wonderful meshing of, like, this white light and,
Yeah, I feel like
so
sometimes
that's what
there
you
aren't
mean.
words, right? It's
Yeah,
you can just see them next to each other and know that there's a kinship. And I think
right.
kind of what we both felt when we connected to that there was, yeah, almost like a language of understanding um
Sure.
that I can't really explain, except though I think the word kinship is really closest to it.
Absolutely. And to go back to, like, Instagram and how we met, like, as soon as I saw your page and your works, it was really like, oh my gosh, it's like a mirror, like, and
Mhm.
I would like to liken it, like, sometimes, you see yourself in the mirror and you don't immediately register it's yourself. You think, oh, this is a familiar face. She could be a friend. And that's the way I want to see
Oh,
that connection.
it's so
So,
beautiful.
yeah.
I think one of the things that we found kinship in was our love of flowers.
Of
Yeah.
course,
And
yes.
and I think you can tell that from our outfits today as well.
Yes.
That we're both wearing a particular shade. Uh,
And I would like to say this dress is sort of, so when I was in Dubai this past month and last year, I saw this bougainvillea, which would, like, it was not exactly pink, but it was not red. So I feel my dress is sort of like, and we all know by now, I'm bougainvillea obsessed. I should be their, like, global ambassador. Just kidding.
Me
But
too. We can both be their
yeah,
ambassadors because I'm wearing my bougainvillea ring.
Yes, of
in
course. I think we were so busy talking, but I forgot to tell, like, say, oh my God, that bougainvillea ring.
yeah,
But
there's
yeah,
there's something there about again, like coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning about these flowers and trees that have like ancestral reminders, and
right,
you were
right,
speaking of the gulab, right? And then for me it's bougainvillea as well, because uh they are very abundant in Kenya, where my um parents and grandparents were born, and it's my immediate home
right,
outside Canada. And for you,
right.
I know it has that kind of ancestral connection as well. Um, or does it? Or what is the
It's
obsession with bougainvillea?
really interesting because so my mother's a botanist, so I've grown
Oh,
up like surrounded by like plants and flowers. But it wasn't until like going back to once again when I started like photo journaling through my phone. I think it's about focus. So once I had something to I had a framework through which to focus on, and naturally flowers started to capture my attention because, as I said, I moved to Pittsburgh and it was spring. But interestingly, it was when I went to Puerto Rico around like this time of the year, and I had just left very cold, chilly Pittsburgh. And the first thing I saw in Puerto Rico was the blue sky and the bougainvillea. And up till that point, I hadn't been really homesick for Oman, but it kind of engendered a homesickness. And I think that the bougainvillea started to become my association with Oman. And I started to remember, the first thing I would see, like, when I would go into my kitchen in my parents' Oman home, which now they moved to Dubai, but like for me in my head, it will always be my childhood home.
mm.
And I would see this bougainvillea silhouetted against the blue sky. So I think it's interesting how that memory conjured that sighting in Puerto Rico conjured up that memory. And yeah, and since then it has I just started to notice all the bougainvillea around me each time I would go back to Oman, and also even in Rajasthan. I'm sure they were there, but it's interesting how you start focusing on things which completely passed by your vision, but now because they're so powerfully they're powerful reminders of home in my case. So yeah, now it's and staring at looking at these beautiful bougainvillea. Now when I went to Dubai last year, and I think they planted like incredible varieties,
Mhm.
and yeah, they just reminded me of like home. And my parents have now made a home in Dubai. So yeah, it was sort of like, these are the linkages. For a second I could pretend I was in Oman, and I was photographing the bougainvillea there, sort of like the illusions the perpetually homesick have in their minds.
I love that. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think for me, it's the same because whenever I visited Kenya and my grandmother's home, my grandmother's garden,
Yeah.
there are so many varieties of plants and trees, but what I always remember is the bougainvillea just kind of falling over
Wow.
in these
So
heaps.
beautiful.
Yeah, and it's this particular shade that's kind of like a fuchsia red, almost indescribable color. And
Yes. Yes.
whenever I see that shade particularly of bougainvillea, it brings me right back to my grandmother and being in the garden as a little girl. So I've been going back since I was 3 years old, and it's the one constant, like as is my grandmother, knock on wood. But it's the one
Yeah.
constant every
That's
time
true.
I return is I'm first greeted by these um blooms, and it's just it's just that sense again, that sense of home or returning to that childhood self. So I can absolutely relate to that. And um yeah, and then the other photo that I've shared here is I started to kind of play again with a lot of what was discarded. So just all the garden waste, or things that had
Yeah.
fallen. And then, how can you illuminate that imperfection? Um,
Right.
so that's something that I would go every morning. I would actually go out into the garden after having breakfast and just observe and pay attention. And it's really interesting that you say that, once you started to pay attention, you notice things that were always there. Because I feel that
Yes.
way about myself for a long time. Like I wasn't as interested in flowers or trees. And my mom is an avid gardener. She's always
Right.
loved
Right.
the garden, and she's a painter.
Yeah.
She has a visual eye. And she was,
Okay.
yeah, and we had such a beautiful garden growing up here. But I don't know, it was almost in the background, you know,
Right.
to serve my
Yeah.
other inspirations. But then something, like you said, something had shifted, maybe perhaps
Yeah.
being away from home, it made you pay more attention to these reminders of home. So yeah, that really resonates deeply with me as well.
Sure. And how you describe the garden, both of course, like, your grandmother's garden, which, it sounds like such a safe and nurturing space. And in your mind, it's like, it's like this memory garden that you can retreat into whenever you're feeling. And yeah, I think, and I love how you described, like, you would see, observe, and like, make these, I think it's like a flower mandala you've made, uh, with whatever like was in the garden. And yeah, it's just like, it's like a literal embodiment of all that we would otherwise dismiss, or, or take for granted, or it just blends in the background. It reminds me, like, I read somewhere about something, plant blindness. Maybe there's a more appropriate way to phrase it. Like, when it comes for trees and things, we take so the trees for granted around us. And, it's only when maybe they're cut down, you realize that, when you cut down a tree, or you cut down a plant or something, you're not just cutting down a one living, you're cutting down so many associations,
Mhm,
memories, and, repositories of so many things.
mhm.
So, like, just being aware of all that is around us and all of these gifts, just not only, I mean, it's, of course, it's a source of um, refuge and pleasure for us, but it's also like, how we need to preserve it. Like, it's just by seeing, we're acknowledging it. And by acknowledging it, we're ensuring that, it
We'll
stays
protect
with
it.
us.
Yeah, hopefully.
That is the hope. That is the hope. But
Yeah.
as we speak, but yeah, it's just like, I mean, and it's also, I know it's kind of a selfish, human centric way that, oh, because we have seen it, so it should be allowed to exist. But, if that is helping all these amazing gifts around us. but
Yeah,
yeah.
it reminded
Yeah.
me, it reminded me of this podcast I listened to in Emergence magazine. It was an interview with Dr. Martin Shaw, and he was talking about how we need to fall back in love with the earth, in order to care about climate change, right? And so,
Right.
talking about climate change and kind of, it's almost like it's outside of us. But if we
Right.
fall in love with a piece of land that is close to us, right? Then there's this, like you said, this sentimentality and this desire to protect it because it holds meaning for us, which of course
Right.
is very human centric. But again,
Yeah.
okay, we can acknowledge that and then actually use that to drive
Absolutely.
change, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And, it sounds a bit fanciful, but I would like to say it. I feel that, like, my internet feed for me is like a garden. It's like a virtual garden. So it's sort of like I can retreat into it, and it's a memory of all those things. All, I mean, and while I love photographing the streets, and I love doing, street photography as well, it is a large sort of like visual library of all that I've seen. So,
Mhm.
and like the flora and the fauna and everything. And it's just like, there's so much out there. And yeah, I mean, before we recorded, we were talking about the heat wave. And as I said, it's only when I started feeling the heat that climate change is no longer this abstract concept. It's
Mhm.
sort of like now that you're feeling it, you're like, wow, there is something. And like maybe similarly with nature, it's like now that you're focusing on it, like you are even more compelled to, wanting to ensure that it remains this way for everyone and for your future generations. So
Absolutely. Yeah, it has to start with that, right?
yeah,
I think
yeah,
we would hope, like, maybe it's an unrealistic hope that people would care about things that they either don't understand or haven't encountered. Um,
yeah,
but you know, that might be unrealistic. So it does
yeah,
it does start with that local place.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, so it's going a little off track, but like many years ago they said that once you place a value on a tree, maybe people would be less likely to cut it down because they realize its economic potential. But if that's, I mean, whatever incentive, if that's the way it works. But yeah,
Yeah. It shouldn't have to be that way, but sometimes, I mean, we have to
yeah,
think about.
exactly. Such a, I mean, it's like, such a, it's the last thing we'd want to associate, like ascribe an economic value to a tree. But if sometimes that's the only language people understand,
Hmm.
I don't
Mhm.
know. Yeah, I
Speaking
just,
speaking of trees, tell
oh my gosh,
us
yes.
about this tree.
This, oh my God. So I have so many emotions when I see this tree because this is so Bangalore for me. To be all tree geek for a minute, for a moment. But so this tree is originally from South America. It's the pink trumpet tree, and yeah, I've just found it like, there's so many trees from in Bangalore which are from all over the world and which have made their home there. And I think I feel an affinity because I see myself in them. Like, I'm been all over and I'm now in Bangalore. And yeah, so this pink trumpet tree is particularly, as they say, they call it Bangalore Sakura cherry blossom. And it is, and it so happened like, sometimes I feel like trees go through their own moods and they're not as inclined to be, in spectacular bloom, or they're conserving their energy. I don't know. But yeah, this tree I took this picture in one of Bangalore's main green lungs, Cubbon Park. And yeah, it was around middle of March, January this year, and Omicron was kind of had once again dull things. So yeah, and as I was saying before we started recording, that when I saw this and juxtaposed with your incredible art, I felt like, it's like the tree is in performance, as is your art.
Hmm.
So yeah, and you had an interesting thing to say about the petals, the
Yeah, and
transition.
yeah, and just even listening to you speak about how some of these trees are not native to India, that they've been brought over, through colonialism. It's something similar that I realized about some trees in Kenya, particularly ones that are almost iconic, right, in their associations
Right,
with
right,
Kenya.
right.
So, for example, the jacaranda comes
I
from
was going, yeah, I
South
was thinking
America.
about that.
Yeah.
Yes, yes,
And so it's just there's a certain period of time in Nairobi, a certain period of the year where all the jacaranda trees are in bloom, and then they shed their petals and line the streets. And it's just like an iconic image, right? And I always thought, okay, Nairobi, when I think of a tree, I think of jacaranda. Um,
yeah.
or one of the trees I think of is jacaranda. And so to find out that actually it's not native to East Africa.
I know, I know.
Yeah. And just learning about that, about, the native trees, and also the impacts of having these trees and plants brought over that might be invasive. So, like, for
Right,
example, eucalyptus, we have eucalyptus trees in Kenya, but they take up a lot of water. And
It's
so,
same.
you know,
Yeah, it's
the
yeah.
droughts, it's not a good thing, right?
It's the
Um,
same here in I believe in Bangalore as well. And sort of to backtrack about like go back to the colonialism aspect, but these trees, the pink trumpet trees, were actually planted in areas where the British lived in Bangalore. So Bangalore used to be it used to be an military town. I mean, it still is. And the British, I think they chose um, uh, if I have the history correct, because the climate was so nice. And so these trees were like planted for ornamental purposes, and they were chosen for like their beauty, but they were planted in very like where the it was not planted in where the for want of a better word, where the natives used to live.
mhm.
So you'll find more like indigenous trees. So I thought that was very interesting as well. I'm sure there is much more research and knowledge about it. And if I have gotten some facts wrong, I'm sorry about that. But that's the impression I. So for that is also a powerful statement as well. That even with the kind of trees you choose to plant, and the situation is that like a lot of the great native trees, indigenous species are now found in sacred spaces in Bangalore. So you'll see in temples or like temple other. So where you plant them and whom you're planting for, that is also another something to think about.
Mhm.
And
That's so powerful to even think about, planting for beauty, right? For our own eyes and benefit,
yeah,
versus how will this impact the ecosystem as well, right?
right,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and I think now we're seeing the effects of that. But back then it was just, oh, the everything is here to serve us, like nature is here to serve us. Um,
Right,
and that's something that I think we're now calling into question, right? That we're not passive participants. We have to take ownership of what that actually means, um, in all its
right,
considerations. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's and then in terms of like I think this tree, I can say that beauty is not just bark deep. It is much more, and like yes, the initial is it's a spectacular sight and it's a spectacular bloom. But yeah, even going back into it's just a reminder of like even though Bangalore is not as such an old city as compared to the other big cities in India, but it has its own history, and the colonialism plays a big part in it. And, incidentally, Cubbon Park was built by the British because they longed for the meadows of their homeland.
Mm,
So, they made like, sort of like this sort of grass meadows. They tried to replicate home. But as you know, we can only replicate home in so many ways. And now Cubbon Park has assumed its own identity.
mm,
And yeah, people
exactly.
flock during winter to see these trees in bloom. And as I said, they've got a new layer, like now they're called Bangalore's cherry blossom. So yeah, it's
That's really
fascinating.
fascinating. Yeah,
Yeah,
fascinating. Yeah, especially to see how it's reclaimed, that it is now part of India's history. And so what does it look like to reclaim those trees or those flowers,
yeah,
and those
yeah. And
spaces?
now that we're talking about it, now I'm thinking I would like to see these trees in their the lands that they were actually came from. Like I want to see that. Like how does it feel? So yeah, maybe one day. Incidentally, I think that they have healing. They're considered to have healing properties.
Right.
The bark is supposed to have healing properties in their native lands. So yeah,
Wow.
very interesting to unpack.
Yeah. And I think for me, when I was looking at this image, it's so beautiful. But I'm also looking at all the petals strewn on the ground, and I just want to
Right.
pick them all up and do something with them. And I think that's, what my image is about. It's just taking these petals or you, things that are discarded by the trees or plants or flowers, that point at which they're turning to decay or shedding, and it's at that point where we want to discard our interest, right? Like, okay, well, they've done their performance, like you said, they've bloomed, now they've shed all the petals, they're no longer of use to us, or we're not interested. And so I'm
Right.
kind of countering that with taking up all the things that they've offered and transforming it into another offering. And so
Right.
that's what my nature art is all about. I don't very rarely do I buy flowers, or yeah, very rarely do I actually make that intention of buying, but it's more gathering what's already been discarded by nature and then transforming it into an offering back to nature. um,
Yeah.
it's also a reminder for me to kind of use what I have, right?
Right. That
They
is,
may not be ideal, right? Like you even look at the bottom of these petals are kind of wilting, or you can see they're dry. So it's not
yeah,
ideal, but at the same time, it's true. You know what I mean? It's true to
it
life.
is. And
Yeah.
I love what you say because I feel that, like, even in, I mean, these petals, flowers are even, it's sometimes more powerfully beautiful in their decay. I often see, like, in early morning, like before the petals and leaves are swept away. And when I see them scattered on the ground or in like natural hillocks, there's another beauty of them. Like, they were beautiful when they were in bloom on the tree, but they're as beautiful as strewn. So how you've interwoven them into this, beautiful art, just appreciate every stage has something to offer.
Speaking of the land and of cycles, I thought we could perhaps end with our closing offerings, our closing poems.
Yeah, just a little bit about this poem. So this I wrote like when I just started writing poetry again in 2017. And this is inspired by the sausage tree flowers, which are very deep violet, like a deep mauve. So there used to be a tree near where I used to live in Bangalore, and I would always find them on the ground. So yeah, uh, flowers are tarot cards too. They beckon me from the street side, these tarot cards promising to map my fate. I am my own cartographer, but I read them anyway. Across the street, the ironing man erases wrinkles on hot cotton, steam rising like a scent of a newly cut tree. I see my fortune doubled, each side a new fortune awaiting to happen. Whom to believe? Which fortune is my fate? I gaze into the heart of my palm. The doubled headline snakes down, river forking before vanishing into nothingness. The abyss we came from will return to. I return the cards for someone else to read, to make a map where none may exist. But for me, I've long known which road I have to take, what awaits for me at its end, as it does for all of us who live and breathe.
So beautiful. I feel like I want to read that a few more times because there are some lines there that are such beautiful reminders. Um, and and I think I'm just going to share my poem, and
Sure.
then we can talk about it. So mine's called Geomancy. Great grandmother comes to me in a dream, her eyes grayer than the steel of the waves before us. She hunches over the sand, fistful of something I can't see. She pours the contents into a pouch and hands it to me. My palm weighs down with the heaviness of river rocks. Flick, flick, as they hit the sand. Flick, flick, as we read their scatterings. Each rock is a question I can't answer. She turns to me, pressing her gnarled finger against my chest. It's your turn now. Which are burdens and which are anchors?
Wow. Yeah, once again, tying back to how our poems aligned and, coincided. But like you were telling me about geomancy, if is
Yeah,
that how you,
yeah,
and
geography.
it's something I'm not familiar with, but after hearing you speak about it and the way you powerfully, conjured up the image of the portrait of your great grandmother, it it just, it's all the more powerful, I think, when you have, like, I don't know, maybe some ancestral figure, and that too, like, the lineage, the matrilineal, you know
Yeah,
aspect of it.
yeah, exactly. And I think for me it was it was a dream. And I just remember her taking these rocks and just kind of throwing them on the sand, and then we were trying to read them. And so,
Yeah,
geomancy in many cultures, basically it's the divination using
yeah,
it's elements from the earth or from the
yeah,
land. So it could be the way that you read sticks,
right,
on a trail, or it could be, the art of actually reading stones, or stone scatterings, for example. So there are many, many examples of this across cultures.
right,
And
right.
so when I read your poem, just the reading the flowers themselves is a form of geomancy, right? And so
Right,
poem is
right,
also about that, about reading these scatterings. But I think we both kind of hit on the same point, which was we can't, they can't tell us.
right.
Um, we have to interpret for ourselves using our own lived experiences. So, at the end of
Absolutely.
the poem, my grandmother, my great grandmother didn't give me an answer. She just said, you decide which are anchors and which are burdens.
Right,
So again,
right.
it's on me. And I think, even can you just even read the last, I think, two stanzas of your poem? There was about the map, because I
Right,
feel like that's correlates really well to
right, right. And it was basically, so I said that, I returned the cards for someone else to read to make a map where none may exist. But me, I've long known which road I have to take, what awaits me for its end, as it does for all of us who live and breathe.
that's something that really struck me, is that you weren't giving us a fortune, but a choice, you know?
Right. And for me, this is, I mean, I don't read tarot, but tarot is something I believe is sort of like a guidance. And it's sort of like, it gives us, it's sort of like guidance for, like, maybe we're lost, and it sort of becomes like a compass which points in directions. And I feel like it's like we already know, in our intuition already knows, but we need maybe something to spell it out for us. And
Mhm.
I think in this day and age, we're so, like, there's so much external chatter, noise, that I mean, at least for me, I've forgotten how to listen to my intuition. I just also wanted to add that I feel that it's also like emblematic of what nature has been for me, that, through so many ways, it's been like a teacher. And whether it's the seasons, how, when trees will bloom, but they'll bloom only when they have to, and so many other things. And they're sort of like, I mean, not everything has to be a lesson. It is really basically what you choose to interpret, like, as something that that's resonating with you at this particular point of time.
Mhm.
And I feel that as the older I grow, the more sync I'm in with my body, I'm also in sync with nature as well. I think we spoke about that. And I feel what I wouldn't have cared or noticed when I was younger is is something I'm just feeling, I'm observing more simply because I'm more in tune with, um, as I said, to my body, and as a result of everything around me.
Mm,
And so, yeah, whatever nature chooses to tell us, or we will choose whatever we want to, how we want to use it as guidance, and even I think seeing things like nests or whatever will strike a chord with you will, like, I believe in science, but I think as in also dreams and poems, it really, those whatever symbols appear, um, they'll only make sense to you in the way, because the associations you have with them.
exactly. I love,
So yeah.
I think that's such a beautiful way to also end our conversation with
Right.
with an a request for people who are listening or following along to pay more attention to what those signs are in their own lives. Yeah.